I could see my notes. I wonder how many of us can remember the Australian of the Year for the last maybe 10 years. No, exactly. You think that, I don't know. Don't even know this year. Yes, I do. This year was some ophthalmic surgeon, wasn't it, from Adelaide, I think? Last year were the two guys that dug out the Thai soccer team, I think. Before that, mostly we don't remember them for a specific reason. It seems to me, I might be wrong here, but I think we don't remember them because they don't represent an aspirational figure for us. You know, they're always some great singer or some great musician or some great sportsman or some great scientist. And it doesn't matter how hard I try, I'll never be that. You know, I remember Adam Goodes was one of the Australians of the Year. Remember who he was? A great Australian rules football player. Yes. Okay. What's the chance of me aspiring to that? Not much at 75, but even when I was young, what's the chance of me ever becoming a great football player? If you're going to look at me to see, it isn't going to happen. I could practice 12 hours a day for my whole life, and I'll never be able to achieve that. And another one that I happen to know is Michelle Simmons, who was, I think, about 3 years ago. She was a professor of quantum physics at UNSW. She was born with an Einstein IQ. There is no way any of us can walk in those footsteps. She's not aspirational for me. I can't look at her and say, wow, I could do that if I really tried. I couldn't. Add up the whole IQ of everybody here, and it'd be half of hers. The fact is that these people do not represent anything which is aspirational for us. We can't look at them and say, I could be like that if I tried. Except maybe one, and maybe some of you remember, within the last 10 years, there was just an ordinary single mum. She was just an ordinary lady raising her child. And the most horrific circumstances. Her child was murdered in front of her by her estranged husband. And I remember the day that happened. I remember her coming out to talk, and I thought, wow, there's something there. She had something that every one of us could aspire to. I could look at the way she exhibited her courage, and I could say, I want to be like that. And that is something which I think is very rare in this world, where they can pick ordinary people, where they were caught up in extraordinary circumstances which were outside their control. And it just seems to me that they're the sort of people that we ought to be able to look at and try to emulate and say they're just ordinary people that didn't have anything that I don't have, had no abilities, nothing that I can't do or try to do the same as what she did. And sometimes I think we make the mistake of looking at the Bible through those eyes of the people there are all so exceptional that we feel somehow that we can't quite live up to an Abraham or an Esther or a Deborah. We sort of feel somehow they're different. We know they're not. We know that they were just ordinary people caught up in extraordinary circumstances, but I'm wondering whether we actually feel that. If I were to ask you, who do you think could be on the right and left hand of Jesus in his kingdom? Would your mind go to a Bible character? Or would you think maybe it's someone in this room? Maybe it's somebody sitting here that will be on the right-hand side of Jesus in his kingdom. And I presume none of you think that. Why? Is something different about us that makes us lesser than a Noah or a Mary? And I think the answer obviously to that is no, we are no different. Jesus was the exception. Jesus, our Lord and Master, is our ideal, who never ever once in his whole life made the mistakes that all of us are prone to make. But at the same time, we look at this and we sort of say to ourselves, we feel somehow isolated, not quite as bad as Australian of the Year, but, you know, Maybe Abraham was the man of the century or millennium or something. And so what I want to do this morning is pick out some really ordinary people out of the stories of the Bible. So ordinary, they don't even get their names recorded. All of these are girls, they're young girls. And I sort of call this sermon Girls Without Names. Because these girls represent to us the magnificence that can happen to a person in a particular circumstance that they never planned, never knew what was coming, but they fell back to their faith in God immediately to give them a strength which every one of us have to admire. The first were a pair of sisters, which I'll talk about for a moment. They were a pair of sisters. I don't know how old they were. They were probably 14, 15, 16 years old maybe. Oh, and maybe I should mention that one of these sisters saved my life. These two sisters were living together with their mum and dad, and they lived in a pretty wealthy area of the city where they were. It was a city set by the sea, so it was a very nice place. It was a place where everybody envied and everybody wanted to live there. So they were in a pretty swanky city, and they would have had a very nice house. Of course, Dad was pretty rich. And so there were the four of them. There was the two daughters and Mum and Dad. And they were living very happily in that place. And the Mum and the Dad were really good people, and they would often take in boarders or people who had nowhere to sleep in the city overnight. If somebody came and they had nowhere to stay, Mum and Dad would have them in. And these two girls were used to this. They were used to visitors coming into the house. And they all participated in helping the strangers feel at home. One particular night, Dad came back with two strangers, two visitors, two men who had turned up at the city gates. Dad used to sit in the city gates. It was his favourite spot. He used to chat to people as they were coming in and out. And these two men, Dad brought them into the house and he introduced them to the girls. The girls thought, nice guys. And then after that had their dinner, probably the girls went back to their room, and Dad and Mum sat down talking to these two men. Suddenly there's a ruckus outside. Suddenly there's noise, and you can look out the window and you can see torches, people holding flames, and they're all at the door of Dad's house. And these two girls must have thought, what on earth? What's going on? And the noise gets louder and louder and louder, and there's a banging on the door, and they obviously realise something is radically wrong. And then there's suddenly silence. And the door opens up. And it's not Dad and Mum standing at the door, but these two strangers. And they say to the girls, are you engaged or married? Do you have somebody you want to take with us? Because we're going to destroy the city. We are going to be a part of a destruction that will take away this city, and there'll be nothing left of it at all. And the two girls say, yeah, we're engaged. That's why I think they're probably 14, 15, 16. And the two strangers said, then go out, you're safe now. All of the men that were outside have gone. Go out, tell your two fiancés to come with us, because there's going to be a great destruction. We're going to rain fire and brimstone from heaven, and there is going to be nothing left of this city and its neighbouring city. So they went and they asked, and they came back. The fiancés wouldn't come. They thought it sounded like a joke. And so the strangers said, Mum and Dad, grab your two girls, get out of here. Get as far away from this place as you can so you're not caught up in the destruction. But Dad was fairly old by this stage, and he said, look, I don't think I can make it all the way up to the mountains. Can I just stay in that little town over there called Zoar? Can I just stay there for a while? And the two strangers said, yeah, you can stay there. That's okay. We'll give you that concession. But whatever you do, do not look back. When you leave, do not look back at the destruction, just go. And so they went. There was some happening on the way the girls didn't quite understand. There was something, some flash of light or whatever. They weren't to look back, so they didn't look back. All they knew was that now there was only 3 of them. There was just Dad and the 2 girls. They got to the town of Zoar and they stayed there, and the people of Zoar said, "We don't want you. You seem to be bad luck to us. The last place you're in just got destroyed. Can you just keep moving?" So they kept on moving, and they went to live up in the mountains, up in the hills. One minute they were living in luxury, probably one of the richest families in the town. The next minute, they're cavemen or women. They're just living in a cave. And the girls find themselves in a circumstance they never dreamt of. When they were back in Sodom, they probably thought, everything's great. Dad and Mum are rich. They'll probably help us get a mortgage. We'll buy a little place, maybe with a view of the Dead Sea. With a bit of luck, we might even get a place down on the water. Had their husbands all lined up. Made plans like any young girl would. Suddenly they found here they were in a circumstance that they had never dreamt of. And so what did they do? Because they could see they were not going to have children to carry on their father's name. The firstborn said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is not a man on earth to come into us after the manner of all the earth." And they made their plan to make sure that they could have children to carry on their father's name. And their plan was born out of concern for the father. I've read some disgraceful things written about these girls by members of our church. People have said that what they did was born out of loneliness and frustration. That's a lie. What they did was born out of the highest motive any human being can have, and that is a love for another. What they did was because they saw that their father was going to have no generation to carry on. We have no concept how important it was for a man to have a line and lineage to carry on after him. And these 2 girls made their plan to support their father in the greatest gift they could possibly give him. And the plan was that they would sleep with their father and have children. And God blessed that plan. The first one became pregnant with a boy child and called his name Moab, which we now know as the father of the Moabites. The next child had a boy child, the next daughter had a boy child and called his name Ben-Ami, from which came the Ammonites. Ben-Ami, was there a cleaning product once called Bon-Ami? I presume that's the French equivalent, I don't know. Anyway, Ben-Ami became the father of the Ammonites. And they were blessed. I would happen to mention that one of these girls saved my life. Because when you look at these 2 girls, they had these children, and the children that they bore carried on the line of Lot. So his generation increased and increased and increased until he became a father of a multitude. Did God ever promise Lot that? Did God ever promise that Lot would become the father of a multitude and have his own inheritance? No, but because of his faith, because he stuck to the heels of Abraham, God blessed him with his own inheritance. And so the eldest girl had Moab, and he had a child, and obviously got married and had a child, and they had a child, they had a child, they had a child, they had a child. Until eventually they had a little girl called Ruth. And then Ruth had Obed and had Jesse and had David, and so we come to the line of Jesus Christ. And it was that daughter who brought us Jesus Christ. And that's how she saved my life. Now, had that not happened, God would have arranged another way, but the fact is that that was the way that was blessed by God, because those girls showed their absolute faith and love to their father. I really love those girls for that. And sometime in the future, I'd love to give them a hug. Just hope they're not too tall. And it would seem to me that they're the sort of people we can look at. These were just ordinary girls. They were just ordinary girls with nothing, no expectation in their life except to maybe have a house down by the water and have a happy marriage. And they ended up producing the Saviour of the universe. They ended up being those that brought us Jesus Christ, and they were just girls without names. Don't even know who they were. That's, to me, the sort of example which is aspirational. That's the example you and I can say. They had nothing going for them that I haven't got. Or maybe a waterfront house. But they had nothing going for them. And they just made their life around God. And just as a blessing to their children, I'll just read 2 verses out of Deuteronomy 2. And the Lord said to me, do not harass Moab or contend with them in battle, for I will not give you any of their land for a possession, because I have given Ar to the sons of Lot for a possession. And when you approach the frontiers of the sons of Ammon, do not harass them or contend with them, for I will not give you any of the land of the sons of Ammon as a possession, because I have given it to the sons of Lot for a possession. And so God chose these 2 girls as a means of salvation. The next girl. The next girl is maybe 15, 16 years old. She's unmarried. She lives in Mizpah. Now, there seem to be a few Mizpahs. I did sort of check this out, and I think there's a couple of them. This one's probably in Gilead. And she lived there. She had a fairly hard upbringing. Dad wasn't around much. I presume Mum was. She's not mentioned. But Dad had a hard life. Dad had been kicked out of his family much earlier on. He was rejected, and Dad took a bunch of guys and went up to Galilee. And while he's up in Galilee, they sort of got a bit of a name for themselves. The Bible says they were raiding. I guess they were just sort of harassing the local tribes that were sort of picking on Israel up there. So she didn't see much of her father. But she did know that he, in fact, was the heir to not maybe a fortune, but he was the heir to quite a good inheritance that had been refused him by his brothers. His brothers had said to him, you can't have it because you're the son of a harlot. Even though he was the son of Gilead, his father, they refused him. And so off he went, left his family at home, it seems, and off he went raiding up near Galilee, until all of the people from Gilead had terrible troubles with the Ammonites. The Ammonites would come down and raid them, and they had to look for a hero who could save them. And they looked for a hero, and they found a hero in Jephthah. And so he came back to the people and said, I'll come on the condition that you accept me as your older brother and the one who was the rightful inheritor, which you rejected. And they said, yes, we'll do all that. Just come and help us. So he came down and the Spirit of the Lord was on him. And it's always interesting, it seems to me, when you read this story. I can't remember how many verses of the chapter are devoted to negotiations to avoid war. Jephthah says to the Ammonites, I've got no problem with you. You people are the children of Lot. You're the ones who received the inheritance of God. I don't want your land. God has allotted that land to you. And then after, I'm guessing, 18 or 20 verses of negotiations, You end up with 2 verses of the battle, which Jephthah won. Can you imagine a Hollywood movie now where 3/4 of the movie was devoted to negotiations and 10 minutes to the battle? Don't think it would quite work. And news got back to the girl and she said, "Man, Dad's won the battle." I guess they lived in a sort of a house with a bit of a compound around it, probably had the potty calves in the compound, like you bring them up when they need weaning. A few goats, a few sheep, and that was probably the compound, and that was the door through which the father expected something to come. But this girl was so excited, she got herself all dressed up and she put bells and whistles on her fingers and her toes and got dressed up in the greatest gear she could find, and she came dancing out of the doorway, dancing out of the compound to meet her father. And he fell down and he said, "Oh, what have you done? I have promised to the Lord that the first thing that came through the doors I would offer as a burnt offering and a sacrifice." Then Jephthah came to his house at Mizpah, and behold, his daughter came out to meet him with timbrels and with dancers. She was his only child. Beside her, she had neither son nor daughter. She was his only child, and beside her, he had neither son nor daughter. Sounds a bit redundant? It's emphasising this was his only child. And when he saw her, he rent his clothes and said, "Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very, very low. You have become a cause of great trouble to me, for I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow." That's got to be one of the most forceful sentences in the whole of the Old Testament. I have opened my mouth unto the Lord, and I cannot go back. What a terrible price he paid for that. She was his only child. That was his line in Israel. That was his lineage. And he said, "You've cut it off. I will have no child now. I will have no grandchild. I will have no great-grandchildren. I will have no tribe. I will have no lineage in Israel." She didn't make a vow. It wasn't her problem. It was him who made the vow. But this was going to destroy her life. And I'm going to reinterpret her answer. Her answer was, "Not my will, Father, but yours be done." She was Jesus Christ at that time. She was Jesus Christ to that generation. People looked at her and saw in her a willing sacrifice on behalf of the Father. It was the Father who had made the plan. But it was she who carried out the sacrifice, who willingly submitted herself. I don't even know her name. And she was just a girl, just an ordinary, average girl, who was willing to submit her whole life to God and sacrifice everything she might have wanted and loved. The last one, this one's a little girl. Oh, I'd like to give Jephthah's daughter a hug too. This one's only a little girl. I think she might be only 7 or 8 or 9. And she's taken captive. She lives probably up the top of Gilead somewhere in the time of Elijah and Elisha. The Syrians came raiding and took her, and so she became a child slave. And she was pressed into service with Naaman's wife in the household. Have you ever thought how old she was and what she might have seen before she came to work for Naaman? I'm guessing she would have been 7, 8, 9, 10, something like that. Anything much older, and she would have been sold into sexual slavery. Had she been 13, 14 or 15, she would not have been used in the household. So I'm assuming that. Had she been taken as a young child? Had she been taken when she was only 2 or 3? And she'd been raised with Naaman's wife? Well, no, that can't be true, because she absolutely knew of the works of Elisha. She knew what he could do. She knew where he was. She must have been a recent abductee. Is that the word? A recent captive, because she knew what was going on in Israel. And do you want me to read a passage out of the Bible that would describe what she saw? As her family was torn apart and the Syrian soldiers came in, murdering, killing. Let me just read. You will set on fire their fortresses, you will slay their young men with the sword, you will dash in pieces their little ones and rip up their women with child. That was the last thing she saw. The last thing she saw as she left Israel was her father killed in front of her, all the young men of the village slain, beheaded in front of her. Probably saw her mother pinned out on the ground, sexually assaulted by a number of soldiers who eventually cut her throat. And then she was taken back to serve the people who had done it. And then the man that organised it, the leader of that army, gets leprosy. Can you imagine how she might have felt? Yes. Oh, I want to see him suffer, God. Can you please make his nose fall off first? Then I want to see his fingers fall off. And I want to see him absolutely cower on the ground before you. None of that was there. She turned and she said, I know someone who can cure you. If only you would go down to Israel to Elisha, he could cure you. How could she find that much love in her heart for the person who had inflicted that much pain on her? And I don't know her name. And she saw further than the prophets. Elisha didn't see that. When Elisha was sent to anoint Hazael to be king over Syria, it was Elisha who was crying and saying, it says that the man of God wept, and Hazael said, why does my Lord weep? And he said, because I know the evil that you'll do to the people of Israel. How you'll set on fire their fortresses, how you'll slay their young men with a sword and dash in pieces their little ones and rip up their women with child. And Hazael said, what is your servant, who is but a dog, that he should do this great thing? And Elisha said, the Lord has shown me that you are to be king over Syria. You see how Elisha missed the point? He missed the point that this little 8-year-old girl got. All Elisha could see was the suffering of the people of Israel. He didn't see that the hand of God had gone out to the Gentiles. Imagine how different the story might have been if Elisha had stood in front of the king and said, you are the luckiest guy on earth. You've been touched by God. God has reached out, the one God of heaven and earth has reached out and selected you to be king. You are now being brought into the fold of the people of Israel. You are now going to learn of the God of the universe. And no, Elijah just cried. Elisha just cried. Missing the point that this little girl had seen. So, what can we say as we come to the table and we come to remember Jesus? It was Jesus' last breath that said, forgive them, Father. Because they don't know what they do. What that little girl had said. It was Jesus who made the statements that we are all forgiven through the sacrifice symbolised by Jephthah's daughter, sacrifice that's come to all of us through the blessing of God. And I just think it's a good lesson that every one of us can look at these little girls and say to ourselves, they do represent an aspirational image for us. Jesus is the greatest. Every one of us models ourselves on Jesus. But you don't have to be special. You can be just an ordinary person. Good morning, everyone.